I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. We're winding down towards the end of the year, and I'm hoping to use the last few weeks of December to catch up on some big books from 2023 that I wasn't able to get to, and maybe even possibly read something that was not published this year. I'm recording from home today, so I'm just going to take a quick look on that shelf over there right in front of me at my pile of things that I'd like to read. There's an old Chester Himes book there. There's a collection of Laurie Moore essays. I'd like to read that. There's a book called Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield that I've been meaning to check out. There is the first book from Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Hernan Diaz, who we spoke to on the podcast after he won his Pulitzer. And that book was loaned to me by one of my coworkers here at the Times. If I don't return it soon, she might put a hit out on me. So I have a pile of things I'm hoping to get to over the holidays. And I hope you also have a pile. I hope you have a lot to choose from. And maybe some of those are books that were on our 10 best books of the year. On this week's episode, I'm speaking with the author of one of those books, John Vaillant, author of Fireweather, A True Story from a Hotter World. Let's turn to that conversation now. John Vaillant, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks, Gilbert. So glad to be with you today.
Well, we're glad to have you. Many of us at the Book Review enjoyed your book, despite it being pretty stressful and troubling. And I have a lot of questions. So let's just jump right into it. John, your book, Fireweather, is about a wildfire that took place in Canada in 2016. Could you tell us just a little bit about what that wildfire was and where it took place?
Sure. Fort McMurray is a really remote petroleum boomtown of roughly 90,000 people in the northern boreal forest of Alberta. It's a 5-hour drive to the nearest city, which is Edmonton, so it's very isolated, but very heavily industrialized. And it's surrounded by boreal forest, which is a historically and naturally flammable environment. And Canadian wildfires, northern boreal wildfires, are normally enormous. You can have 1,000 square mile fire and it won't make the news. So there was such a fire burning outside of Fort McMurray on May 3rd, 2016. The wind changed. As predicted, the fire entered the city, but with a ferocity no one had anticipated. And it swept through the city from end to end, triggering the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times.
I have so many sort of definitional questions. My first one is, what is the boreal forest? You write about it as something that literally spans around the entire globe. What is this thing?
It's a colossal entity. It's the largest forest system in the world, and it forms a ring around the northern hemisphere. So all the way across the top of Canada, through Alaska, across Russia, where it's known as the taiga, through Scandinavia, touches down on Iceland, picks up again on Newfoundland, and just keeps going. And so it's really like a green wreath around the northern hemisphere. And so this system is, it's a mixed forest of conifers and deciduous, but one of its trademarks is it burns down on a regular basis. And there are species of tree, including black spruce in there, whose cones will not open unless they're heated to temperatures greater than what the sunlight can achieve on its own. And what that tells these seeds when they become fire hot is that the canopy is now open above because there's been a fire. The ground has been cleared, again, because of the fire. And now it's that seed's turn to take a shot at it and become a new forest.
So you say the boreal forest burns down on a regular basis. This is something that nature has baked into its cycle of destruction and rebirth. What is it about the nature of the boreal forest, at least in Canada now, that makes it so susceptible to endangering humans in a way that it never had before?
Yeah, well, Gilbert, we're entering this period of invisible thresholds that we are crossing in all kinds of ways. It's happening in the oceans, it's happening in the atmosphere, it's happening across the landscape. And so the forest looks the same to most of us. But if you're a boreal hydrologist, you'll notice it's a lot drier than it used to be. You'll notice also, if you're an atmospheric scientist, that it's a lot warmer than it used to be. So these fires that would normally burn through from, say, May to September, the normal temperature there might be, go down to the 40s at night, get up to the 70s during the day. Relative humidity would be in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s. Well, now you can have humidity more like Southern California. So it might be 10% or 12%. That's as dry as a desert. And then you'll have temperatures in the 90s. And so you tweak the atmosphere like that, and then you put a fire on the landscape. The fire behavior will be qualitatively different and read much more intense. And that's what we're discovering now. And that's, we had the summer from hell up here in Canada all through 2023. New York, you really, took it in the teeth in June with that cascade of orange smoke that came down and shrouded the city. That was all coming out of Quebec and Ontario. We had that all summer long in various parts of the country. And that's, a little bit hotter, a little bit drier. It feels like maybe a warm summer day to you, but the forest and fire interprets it differently and more flammably.
There are, unfortunately, lots of wildfires every year, and there have been for the past many years. How did you decide on this particular one as the one to build a book around?
Well, that's a really good question, because there have been so many intense ones. But back in 2016, as recent as that seems, it really was sort of a more innocent time for fire. So many of the big fires that loom in our consciousness right now are post-2016. And Fort McMurray was such an anomaly. And I think for me to answer that question, you have to understand what Fort McMurray means in the Canadian consciousness. It's this colossal petroleum powerhouse where people make $200,000 a year, and it's this engine of industry and prosperity that looms over the entire country. It's also the largest source of foreign imports into the United States. So the idea of that disappearing under a 40,000-foot tall fire cloud on a sunny afternoon in May was really almost inconceivable. It was really shocking and unsettling. And not just obviously for the people who lived there, but even as a witness. I just saw the photos streaming over Twitter, and I kind of couldn't believe it. Because again, this place that has more heavy machinery than practically anywhere else in North America, it's a kind of an all-conquering industrial force unto itself. And the idea that it would be overwhelmed by a fire coming out of the trees was really dissonant. So that was the first. And then when I started understanding what that fire did, that it burnt houses down in 5 minutes. So more and more, I just realized, I began to understand, okay, this isn't a one-off. This is actually a bellwether. And I better pay attention.
I feel like I had heard tangentially about Fort McMurray in the past. I didn't really know that much about it. The first time I came across it really was in a book from last year, a graphic novel called Ducks by Kate Beaton, which was, Kate Beaton is a famous cartoonist, and it was her account of working up there when she was a younger person. But very good book. I believe it was on the New York Times' 100 Notables of last year. All our listeners should check it out if they haven't. But Fort McMurray, boomtown. When I think of boomtowns, in my mind, being an American, I'm thinking of the Wild West. I'm thinking of the Gold Rush. I'm thinking of maybe Oklahoma in the early 20th century. But Fort McMurray really fits this definition. Just tell us about this really unique place.
A great place to start is with Ducks and with Kate Beaton's wonderful book. And I read that kind of as a confirming reference after I was pretty finished with mine and was reassured that I'd gotten it mostly right. But Kate Beaton did her time up there, and it's really terrific. So Fort McMurray is an absolute anomaly in North America. There is no other place like it. It's got a population of roughly 90,000 temporary workers and permanent residents. So it's in a very isolated location in the boreal forest. It's about 5 hours from Edmonton. There's nothing else comparable anywhere else near it. And yet it's this industrial powerhouse where this massive bitumen excavation and melting process is going on. It's related to the petroleum industry, but it's not oil like you and I think of it. It's literally tar bound up in quartzite sand that has to be dug out with massive machines and then melted with natural gas and then fractionated into usable portions of the petroleum spectrum and with using more natural gas. So billions of cubic feet of natural gas are used every day to render this unbelievably intransigent substance into something that a foreign, namely American, refinery can recognize. And it's still a really heavy, ugly petroleum product, but people have found ways to make it profitable. And so the profits being made up there are astronomical. And so folks from the seriously impoverished Maritimes, Eastern Canada, where Kate Beaton is from, flock to Fort McMurray because they're tired of being broke. And you can make, as a truck driver, $200,000 a year up there. And it's money like no Canadian has ever seen before. There's really almost no other municipality in North America that has a median household income of $200,000. Maybe in Marin County or Westchester or places like that, but otherwise it's pretty hard to do. And in Canada, it's utterly unique. So it looms very large in the Canadian psyche. And it also has a huge environmental impact. So the flare stacks where they off-gas, the waste fuels, are 600 feet tall. The first time I was up there and saw them burning, they were 30 miles away from me. I thought it was the sun setting. It's like the Eye of Sauron. It's, and I'm not exaggerating. It's an extraordinarily intense place to be.
The scale of things in Fort McMurray, and you write about this in the book, is quite out of proportion to human existence. You talk about these trucks, and I can't remember precisely how big they are, but they sound like Transformers. I mean, they are huge.
Yeah. Big as your house.
And they're the ones that carry the tar sands out, which, again, I feel like I've been a little imprecise in describing your book for the past couple of weeks. It's like, oh, they take the oil out of the ground. But as you rightly point out, it's not oil as we think about it. It's something completely different.
Yeah, it's a giant tar-clotted sand dune covered with forest. They use gigantic bulldozers way bigger than you'd ever see on an urban work site to plow the forest down. And then they bring in these huge shovels with scoops that are about the size of a 2-car garage. And with that, they scoop out the bituminous sand, the tar-soaked sand, put it into 400-ton dump trucks that are 3 stories tall. The tires alone weigh something like 6,000 pounds. They're 13 feet tall, cost $85,000 a piece just for a single tire. And these heavily laden trucks, now weighing millions of pounds because of the tar sand in them, go off to these crushing machines that are these, again, inconceivably large studded cylinders that you pour the frozen lumpy matter into. It crushes it up. One guy who worked there was trying to communicate to me how intense these machines are. And he said, well, the crusher will consume a city bus in 3 seconds. So that's the scale of things. And so people get very small there. And it's got a sort of Fury Road kind of a vibe there. You know, the burning of petroleum is a kind of secular virtue.
That's one of the great ironies, of course, if that's the right word, of the story that you tell, which is that this town that came up out of nothing in order to extract tar sands from the earth and make great amounts of wealth for corporations and for people that work for corporations was itself the victim of a wildfire that was only able to become as powerful as it did because of the very effects that Fort McMurray itself is having on the earth.
It's like Ouroboros, you know, it's like the snake, the serpent swallowing its own tail. And so it's a weird kind of feedback. And when you think of the colossal quantities of input in terms of natural gas that's being burned to render this tar, the just uncountable BTUs being generated every day. And then the forest, which they refer to as overburden, because that's what the bulldozers push off and pile up in order to access the bituminous sand. The idea of this forest, and these are 50, 60-foot trees, being able to generate enough energy to overwhelm this whole industry and actually generate more raw energy than all that natural gas and all that bitumen can by itself. And so this fire front, again, when we think of a Canadian wildfire, this fire front is maybe 5 miles wide, maybe 10 miles wide, sweeping into the city like a wave. So these flames are 300 feet tall, and they are roaring into the city, projecting heat. And so radiant heat is the heat that tells you not to touch the candle. And it moves at the speed of light. And the radiant heat coming off this tidal wave, this tsunami of fire, was about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. And so everything in front of it, even before the fire gets there, gets way past combustive temperature and then starts off-gassing. And so that's what fire interacts with. It doesn't burn the house. It heats the house up until the tar and the vinyl siding and the wood all start to vaporize and off-gas hydrocarbons, and then it bursts into flame. And that's what these neighborhoods became. They became these kind of total combustion chambers because they were just off-gassing clouds of all volatile gases, which is what the modern house is made of. When you think of all the glues and laminates and plywood and flooring, think of the vinyl siding, think of the tar shingles, think of all the plastic stuff we have and the mattresses we sleep on. It's all synthetic. All that stuff, when you get it up to temperature, will start off-gassing and become as flammable as a gas can.
John, you go into incredible detail about I've been describing it as almost a beat-by-beat account of this fire. I was wondering, because I want people to read the book, if you could just give us a quick summary of how long this fire lasted, how it swept through the town, and then how was it possible for 90,000 people to be evacuated and there to be almost no casualties as a result of this fire?
This is a kind of enduring miracle and mystery to me, especially when you think of Lahaina and Paradise and what's happened in Spain and Australia and these terrible tragedies with really serious fatalities. And now you have in Fort McMurray, you have this city of roughly 90,000 people overwhelmed by fire. The evacuation order was delivered late. It was very sporadic. Most people found out that it was time to leave because their neighbor called them, or simply literally because they looked out their window and saw fire coming down the street toward them. Making matters worse is because these are new developments, sprawling around this older city. Most new developments just have one road in and one road out. Fort McMurray, the city, has only one road in and one road out. So the opportunities for becoming entrapped, for the fire burning over the road, were numerous. And what's interesting about it is that it came in incredibly rapidly. And the fire actually burnt inside the city for many days, which is almost unheard of in an urban fire. They're usually quite rapid events. And due to wind changes and just the vicissitudes of weather and terrain up there, the fire kept coming back into the city in this very sort of Grendel or Godzilla-like way. It kept taking runs at the city. But on that first terrible day, when everybody evacuated, the whole city was abandoned, kind of Chernobyl-like, in one afternoon. And they all jumped in their cars, because of course that's what everyone has up there. They all poured out into the highway, and there was an instant traffic jam. And what's amazing is that it was a combination of extraordinary courage on the part of firefighters and police who helped organize the traffic, but the citizens themselves did not panic. So there wasn't this free-for-all of people jumping the median, racing around each other. There was a kind of social cohesion in the city that kept people together. So the fire is burning right up to the windows of their cars. Their paint is blistering. Their kids are in the back screaming. They're probably weeping themselves, and they kept it together. So there was a kind of solidarity, and some of that you could say, well, is that sort of Canadian kind of responsibility and obedience? But what's interesting about Fort McMurray, there are 80 different first languages spoken up there. It's a polyglot city. It's an international place. So you have different religions, different languages, different concepts of what danger is and how to respond to it. And somehow everybody more or less kept it together. And the other thing that was amazing is for days and days, nobody knew who would be left, what they would find in those burnt basements. And there were nobody died in the flames. And that, to me, honestly, Gilbert, it brings tears to my eyes every time I think about it. This incredibly diverse city, Somali refugees and old Newfoundlanders and everything in between. The net closed and gathered everybody and pulled them out safely. And the city burned, and it was a terrible trauma, but everybody got to hug their kids the next day. And so there was a strange mercy in this terrible, terrible disaster. And that is something that I think is worthy of further study.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined by John Vaillant, author of Fireweather, one of the New York Times' top 10 books of the year. John, I read a quote from an interview you did in which you say, "I feel like I violated one rule of nonfiction, where there isn't a through-line character." One of the things that the editors of the Book Review commented on time and again as we discussed your book over several months was this very fact that there wasn't one person that you were following throughout. Instead, in the parts where you were describing the wildfire as it swept through Fort McMurray, it felt like the fire itself was personified, and you used language to this effect at certain points. What went into that decision, and what was your concern about not having a through-line character?
Well, I'm a nonfiction writer principally, and I take that responsibility seriously. And I recognize the need of the reader to have someone to sort of hang out with and go through the journey with. And as I tried to grapple with really the enormity of the Fort McMurray fire, it went on for so long. It impacted so many people. It damaged things in so many different and strangely creative ways. There was just no one person who captured it all. But there was this dynamic energy moving through the story all the time, and that was fire itself. And so basically the role that humans play are human sensory organs perceiving the fire at different stages, whether you're a citizen trying to flee it, whether you're a firefighter trying to fight it, whether you're a climate scientist trying to understand it. It's just a massive entity. And I think, I wrote a book called The Tiger a few years ago in which I really tried to, as much as one can, get into the mind of the tiger and what's going on for that. And, Ed Young just wrote a really beautiful book about that called Immense Worlds. This Immense World, I think it's called. Anyway, it's a terrific book that really gets into the world of the other. And fire is for me, was this ultimate challenge to try to experience the world through that chemical reaction. And it seemed like the honest way to do it. And so it was a bit of a leap. It was a risk, but it also felt like, given the role that fire is increasingly playing in our world now, it really deserved to be focused on its own merit, from its own point of view, if you will.
Now, there's a lot more to this book on top of your account of the Fort McMurray wildfire. You go into the history of petroleum extraction in North America. You go into the history of climate change science itself. And while fire itself is, in effect, the main character of the Fort McMurray strain of the book, there are lots of people and characters that you spoke to. I meant you did a ton of research for the history, but what was the process of of reaching out to people that actually experienced the wildfire? How did you find them, and what was it like to ask them to relive this terrible event?
Well, that's a really tough one, Gilbert, because Alberta is the Texas of Canada. That's the shorthand. And it really, they mirror each other in all kinds of ways. Vancouver is sort of the LA, San Francisco of Canada. So, we're kind of lefty, liberal, artsy types out here, at least in my world. And so going into Fort McMurray and saying, "Hi, I'm John from Vancouver. Tell me about the worst day of your life." There is a 2-word answer to that question or response that's totally appropriate and totally understandable. And I have to say...
Please don't say it here.
I won't. We can all imagine. The folks in Fort McMurray received me, as you can see from the book, very graciously and with tremendous, sort of heartbreaking candor. And people wanted to talk about it. People wanted me to understand it. I did not know anybody when I went up there, so I met people just person to person. "Oh, if you're interested in this, you might want to talk to that person. Oh, you want to hear about the water system? Well, I know the guy who runs the waterworks. Why don't you call him? We're going out for beers on Friday. Why don't you, or whatever." So it was this very organic, think of a crystal growing. That's kind of how I made the connections in the community. And people were really beautiful and generous and open and honest. And part of what makes the book powerful is these are ordinary people who got a glimpse of a version of the near future. And they survived to tell about it. And they shared that experience with me. And so there's sort of almost like a rhyme of the ancient mariner kind of quality. I've seen this thing, I've been through this thing, I got to tell you about it. And so some of these interviews turned into 3-hour, 6-hour extravaganzas where they were just laying it out for me. And I was, deeply, deeply grateful to them. And it also was really humbling for me because I come with all my West Coast baggage into this, petroleum boomtown. And I got to let go a lot of my opinions and remote judgments. And just, it made me be a better human being. So there was sort of a real, there was a personal growth that occurred for me personally going through that experience of listening to them and basically being at the receiving end of their very brave generosity.
If Alberta is the Texas of Canada, as you described it, what is the, how do I put this? What is the way in which some of the residents maybe, how do they deal with the fact that they're involved in this industry that is regarded by many people as being the thing that is leading to a worse future? That they, the effects that extraction of oil sands and tar sands has on the earth is a hotter earth, and a hotter earth means more intense wildfires, more flooding, higher water, all that stuff. How do they deal with those two truths at the same time, if at all? And how do they think about it following this disaster?
Yeah, it's so that Fort McMurray rebuilt itself again in its own image, only bigger. The companies up there are wanting to expand their bitumen operations. The conservative government of Alberta has a kind of Texas-like policy of we don't talk about climate change, we don't acknowledge climate change, and in fact, they're actively suppressing efforts to expand wind and solar, which Texas isn't. Texas is embracing it. Texas is kind of taking all comers, but Alberta is really going hard on its allegiance to the petroleum industry. So there's a lot of denial up there. And then for the people who work in the industry, these are folks, most of whom are coming from really limited or straitened circumstances in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And they are really glad to be making a living. They're really glad to be creating a home for their children that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. And so there's that line, which I can't quote for you perfectly, from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, where sometimes a man has to not understand what he's doing in order to be able to do what he's doing or not think about what he's doing. And so I think they just kind of blanket out and all of us live in enormous dissonance all the time if you really start thinking about it. And And so they live in maybe greater dissonance, but for them, the immediate needs of feeding the family, of achieving some level of sort of social and economic achievement that their forebears haven't been able to is paramount. And I mean, there's no question they can feel it up there. It's absolutely hotter. It's absolutely smokier. Just this summer, petroleum operations were shut down due to wildfire. You can't work in the heavy smoke. Even if it's not on fire, the smoke will shut it down. And so the world is closing in around Alberta in that sense. And in that sense, they almost double down on the denial. And I think we need to make a really clear distinction between the political and the management of these companies and the citizenry. And the citizenry are just trying to make it work and keep it together and get through the day and deal with the fact that they've got 65 more payments to make on that pickup truck that they bought. And they are kind of getting ground up between the fact of climate change and this very cynical and deceptive message that they're getting from this kind of allegiance between the politicians and the industry up there.
When I was reading this book, I was worried that you were going to run out of ways to describe fire, and maybe you were worried too. But it's impressive how many sort of metaphors and analogies and descriptive language you were able to bring to bear on all the different manifestations of fire. How did you avoid repetition? How did you say, wow, I have to describe this in this way, and I've already written about it 5 times before?
If you counted the number of times I say fire, it's probably a scary number. But I also recognize that a lot of us are kind of burnt out, so to speak, on climate change. And so I had to find fresh language. And what you're trying to do is find images, words, angles of approach that basically the reader isn't already too jaded to take in or isn't already defended against. And so I'm trying to find language that's sort of fresh and new and animated, for this subject that kind of gets past people's defenses. And so, we're lucky because, I feel incredibly blessed to have facility in the English language because it's so rich. There's so many different ways you can use it, and the vocabulary is so huge. And so I just took it as a really wonderful challenge. How do I keep it fresh for myself? This book took me 7 years to write. And so how do I stay interested in it? How do I keep that head of steam up? And that's what pulls the reader through, is you've got to feel the writer's energy in there. That's carrying you along. And so that's part of the gig. If you're a professional writer, part of it is having access to a lot of language and being dexterous with it. And so, that's something that is one of the great joys of the business for me.
Now, I would imagine you probably would not prefer to be this way, but you released this book, as we alluded to before, into a year in which there were more than one pretty notable and highly covered wildfires. And as you referenced before, and as I've said in some other places, several of us on the book review were reading this book while the smoke from those Canadian wildfires were coming down through New York City and turning the sky previously unseen shades of dark orange, frightening shades of dark orange. What is it like to release a book into that sort of environment, to have to go out there and talk about it while these things continue to happen?
Well, Gilbert, obviously nobody could have predicted this. And honestly, I was afraid as year after year passed while I'm still writing the book, is this going to go stale? Did I miss my window? And at the same time, what motivated me to write the book was talking to people in Fort McMurray, how traumatized they were, how frightening it is. And honestly, there's an element of this book for me that's just a public service announcement. This is really scary. You don't want this to happen to you. And that's how people in Fort McMurray feel too. They don't want it to happen to others. And so when this horrible cloud settled over the eastern seaboard, there were a number of us out here who also thought somewhat grimly, okay, now you sort of get a sense of what it's like to be on the West Coast this past decade. Now you're kind of feeling our pain. And you've seen the photographs in the newspaper, but it's really intense when it's out your window and you feel it in your lungs and you feel it in your psyche. And so it's a strange moment. And I hope the book is equal to the moment, because we're in a really serious situation here with our climate and with the increasing flammability of the entire planet. And it's not just I did this too. I think, well, that's California. That's Australia. I live in British Columbia. We're in the rainforest up here. Well, the rainforest is burning now. And that's deeply, deeply upsetting and fundamentally wrong in all kinds of ways. And so, what part of what propelled me through this book over those 7 years was just the urgency of that and the pain of that, frankly. And so I would never wish this on anybody else. But the one upside is when I talk about this book with people, whether they're on the East Coast or the West Coast or in Europe, they're nodding their heads with a kind of recognition that they might not have had even 3 years ago. And so there is an empathy there. In a sense, we're all downwind. And, flood-wise, we're all downstream. We really are all in this together. And that's the only upside I can see to the smoke and the fire, is that we can't just say, well, that's Australia, that's California. I don't know what those people chose to live there, whatever. We can't do that anymore. We're on planet Earth now. And we're going through this together. And that's, again, where Fort McMurray offers this really potent example. They went through it together and they got everybody out safely enough so that they could, recalibrate and think about how they want to do it again. And a whole bunch of people went back and are just doing the same thing again to the detriment of everything. But there are others who have left, who are really reevaluating. And that's a hard journey, especially when it comes in such a shock. You can't force people into changing their minds, but the fire forced people to let go of their trust and their belief in the life they were living. And now they're trying to rebuild it. And, it's the same thing, I think, when if there's a shooting at a school, it used to be a safe place. And now how do I evaluate that now? How do I live in that place now? And that's what's happening to people who are going through these fires. And so there's this undermining of trust and faith in the world as we knew it. And we have to deal with that together. I really want to have that conversation with people. And I'm grappling with that myself.
There are several different manifestations of climate change in the lives of everyday people. There are hotter temperatures, there's rising waters and more frequent occurrences of flooding where flooding had not occurred before. And then there's fire, which is perhaps the most dramatic of those three, at least. Has this affected your relationship to fire, to fire pits, to cooking, to fireplaces, to I don't know. How could you write a book for so long about this elemental force and write about it in so many different ways, and then have to go out into a world again where it's just something that we use every single day?
Well, one of the things that I explored in the book was our personal relationship to fire, and in a way, our identification with it. It's in so many aspects of our lives, from a candlelit dinner to a pilot light and a water heater in the basement, where we've got fires going all the time, and of course in all our car engines. And so we're surrounded by it. And so I think I'm much more attuned to its presence now. And, I have a fireplace in my living room, and I love fire. It gives me enormous comfort. As a northerner who grew up in an old house, I grew up in New England. Fire was this thing to gather around, and you feel connected. It makes you feel safe. It makes you feel warm. And so then to have it turn on us in these ways, it unsettles all that. And yet I still have this love for it and fascination with it. And one of the things that forced me to explore through the book was, are we related to it? Is it enough? Is it our companion? Is it just a tool, or is it almost more like a dog, like a dog in the form of a glowing chemical reaction that's a companion to us? And dogs bite us too sometimes. Dogs are descended from wolves. Domesticated fire is, in a sense, descended from wildfire, and yet we let it into our homes. And so I'm really intrigued by that dynamic, and that it makes me feel connected to my ancient ancestors in Africa, the first people to control fire, probably 1 million years ago. Not even Homo sapiens, but Australopithecus. And so, we're part of this great lineage. And our downside is, by liquefying petroleum, we've amplified the power of fire and the emissions of fire to the point that we've actually enabled fire to burn more intensely. And that raises the question, who's serving whom? Really? Is fire our servant, or are we fire's servant? Because right now, fire burns more broadly, more intensely on planet Earth than it ever has in human history.
John Vaillant, thank you so much for being on the Book Review podcast. Congratulations on your book, and happy holidays.
Gilbert, what a joy to speak with you, and thank you so much.
That was my conversation with John Vaillant, author of Fireweather, a true story from a hotter world. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.